Hey there. Ever find yourself standing at a crossroads, like maybe literally, and you're trying to decide which way to go?
Happens all the time.
Right. You've got like that gut feeling pulling you one way.
Oh, yeah.
But then your memory chimes in with
Yeah.
like, wait, wasn't there construction on that street last time?
It's fascinating, isn't it, how our brains kind of juggle all those past experiences to guide our decisions, often without us even realizing it.
Absolutely. And,
Yeah.
we love to dig into the how and why behind like those everyday brain mysteries.
It's the best kind.
Right. So that's why we're diving into this research paper you sent over. It's all about how our brains use memories to make those on-the-fly decisions, especially in spatial navigation.
And it's not just about, what decisions we make, but how we get there. This study gets seriously clever, using a virtual maze to understand how people use their memories to navigate.
So think of it like a video game version of those memory tests where you have to recall the locations of hidden objects.
Oh, yeah.
But here's the twist. In this virtual maze, choosing the right route could earn you some virtual cash or lead you down a dead end.
Oh, no. See, they wanted to see how people use their past experiences to navigate, especially when there was like an element of risk involved.
So they designed a few different scenarios within this virtual maze. Sometimes you had complete freedom to explore and rely on your memory.
Like trying to find your way around a new city without a GPS. Think about those moments when you're retracing your steps, trying to remember which turn led you to that amazing bookstore you stumbled upon, or the dead end that had you backtracking for blocks.
Exactly. And just like in real life, the researchers found that people's brains had some fascinating ways of tackling this navigation challenge.
They discovered that some people consistently approach the maze with a consider everything strategy. Imagine someone who meticulously plans their route based on every single past experience in that city, weighing the pros and cons of each turn.
So they're the ones comparing mental notes like, okay, last time I was looking for that independent coffee shop, taking a left here worked out great. But that other time, when I was after the vintage clothing store, that same left turn set me way off course.
Yeah, they're taking it all into account. The researchers called this the target common approach. These folks are like the holistic planners of the maze running world. On the other hand, some people were laser-focused, primarily considering experiences related to their current goal.
So if their mission was to find that bookstore, they'd block out all those memories of searching for the coffee shop or the vintage store.
Exactly. It was all about efficiency and relevance for this group, which the researchers dubbed the target-specific thinkers.
What I find most intriguing is that the study found that neither of these approaches was inherently better.
Right.
It's not that one group consistently made better decisions than the other.
Interesting.
It's more about how our brains are wired to approach these spatial puzzles.
It's like some of us are wired to be meticulous planners, while others are designed for hyper-focused efficiency. And this isn't just some abstract concept. These different strategies actually showed up in the brain scans.
Okay, now we're talking. I'm always fascinated by how our inner mental gymnastics reveal themselves in brain activity.
Right.
So what lit up when these maze runners were put to the test?
Well, in the explore and remember scenario where people had to rely solely on their memory, a couple of key areas stole the show. You can think of these areas like the brain's strategic command center for decision-making.
Ooh, I love it when we get to peek inside the brain's control room. Lay it on me, what are these strategic hotspots?
One of the stars was the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, or DMPFC for short. This area is like the brain's strategic planning department. It helps you weigh different factors like, how well did I do last time?
Okay.
What do I already know about this place? What's
Yeah.
the worst that could happen if I take this turn?
Basically, it's the part of your brain that's working overtime when you're trying to navigate a new city, or even just trying to remember where you parked your car.
You got it. And the more active the DMPFC was, the more closely people's decisions matched that target common strategy we talked about. Remember, the meticulous planners who consider all their past experiences, it's like having a little voice in your head saying, hold on, let's consider all the angles before we commit to this left turn.
Oh, I definitely have that voice. Sometimes it even makes me miss my exit because I'm so busy weighing all the options.
That's a classic target common conundrum. But hey, at least you're thinking strategically, right? Now, along with the DMPFC, there's another key player in this decision-making hub, the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, or VLPFC. This area is really intriguing.
Ooh, another brain region with a mouthful of a name. What's the VLPFC's claim to fame?
This part of the brain is really important for memory retrieval and selection. It's like having a personal archivist who can pull up relevant past experiences to guide your decisions.
So while the DMPFC is busy planning and weighing options, the VLPFC is saying, hey, remember that time you took a shortcut through the park and ended up completely turned around? Yeah, let's maybe avoid that route this time.
Exactly. And the study found that the VLPFC was particularly active during those explore and remember scenarios, where participants had to rely heavily on their memories to navigate the maze. It seems to kick into high gear when we need to sift through our mental archives and pick out the most relevant experiences.
It makes sense that those two areas, the DMPFC and the VLPFC, would work together in those situations. It's like they're having a little strategy session in your brain. Okay, what are our goals? What do we know? And what have we learned from past mistakes?
Absolutely. It highlights how interconnected these different brain regions are, especially when we're navigating unfamiliar territory. But here's where things get even more interesting. The researchers also wanted to see what happens in our brains when we have some guidance.
So instead of wandering around a new city on our own, it's like we finally caved and turned on the GPS.
Exactly. In this next scenario, participants still had to navigate the maze, but now they had an arrow pointing them towards the target. This time, it was less about remembering the exact route and more about understanding spatial relationships.
So instead of thinking, okay, to get to the bookstore, I need to take two lefts and then a right, it's more like, okay, the arrow's pointing that way, so I need to head in that general direction.
You got it.
Yeah.
And as you might expect, different brain areas lit up when people had this spatial guidance. Instead of the DMPFC and VLPFC being the stars of the show, this time it was the superior parietal cortex, or SPC.
Is that like the brain's internal compass?
It's not quite that simple, but you're on the right track. The SPC is really important for how we process spatial information, especially when it comes to our own position and movement.
So when we have that arrow guiding us, our brains can relax a bit on the memory recall and focus more on those spatial relationships. I'm here, the target is there. What's the most efficient way to get from point A to point B?
Exactly. And just like in the previous scenario, the study found that the more active the SPC was, the more closely people's decisions aligned with what the researchers expected.
So it seems like our brains have different teams of neurons for different navigational tasks. One for when we need to rely on memory and explore, and another for when we have some guidance and can focus on spatial strategies. It makes you wonder, do we switch between these brain teams in other areas of life too?
That's a great question, and one that researchers are still exploring. But this study gives us a fascinating glimpse into how adaptable our brains are, even when we're faced with the same basic challenge navigating our environment.
This is reminding me of all those times I've argued with my GPS. Sometimes I swear it's trying to take me the least efficient route possible.
That's a classic navigation conundrum. But remember, even with a GPS, there's still a bit of decision-making happening in our brains. We're constantly weighing factors like traffic, road closures, and even just our own preference for scenic routes.
It's like a constant mental tug of war between what our GPS is telling us and what our own instincts and experiences are suggesting.
Exactly. And speaking of instincts and experiences, remember how we talked about those target common and target specific thinkers? Well, the researchers also wanted to see how those individual preferences played out in the brain.
So did they find that people who lean towards one strategy or the other actually showed differences in their brain activity?
You bet. It turns out those preferences weren't just some abstract concept. They were reflected in how strongly certain brain areas were activated.
Okay, now this is where things get really mind-blowing for me, so tell me more. What did they find?
Well, remember how the DMPFC, that strategic planning part of the brain, was really active during those explore and remember scenarios?
Yeah, it was like the DMPFC was the MVP of memory-based navigation.
Exactly. Well, they found that the stronger the activity in the DMPFC was during those tasks, the more consistently people stuck to that target common strategy, the one where they consider all their past experiences.
Hold on. So it's not just that some people use the target common approach more, it's that their brains are literally wired to make it their go-to strategy.
That's the idea. And it gets even cooler. They also found that the strength of the connection between the DMPFC and another brain area, the hippocampus, which is like the brain's memory center, was also linked to this target common preference.
So the more connected those two areas were, the more likely someone was to be a meticulous planner, considering every nook and cranny of their past experiences. It's like having a direct line between the strategic planning department and the memory archives.
You could say that. Meanwhile, the VLPFC, our memory archivist, seemed to be a bit more of a team player. It was active in both the explore and remember scenarios and the GPS-guided scenarios.
So whether you're relying on your memory or following directions, the VLPFC is there to lend a helping hand with its memory expertise.
Precisely. It highlights how dynamic our brains are, constantly adapting to the demands of the task at hand. But now, I know you're probably wondering about that third scenario the researchers threw into the mix. The one where the risks and rewards were constantly changing. Remember that one?
Oh, yeah. That was the scenario where participants had to factor in changing probabilities, kind of like when you're trying to predict traffic patterns or outsmart a slot machine. It seemed like that one would require some serious mental gymnastics. What did the brain scans reveal about that challenge?
Well, surprisingly, that's the one scenario where there weren't any super clear-cut brain activation patterns that lined up perfectly with those target common and target-specific models.
Really? But that scenario seemed like it would demand the most brain power.
It did. But sometimes a lack of clear-cut brain activity can be just as telling as a burst of activity.
So if our brains weren't lighting up in obvious ways during that unpredictable scenario, what was going on behind the scenes, did the researchers have any theories?
They did. One possibility is that in that particular scenario, the risks and rewards, they kind of ended up balancing out over time.
Oh, yeah.
It might have been a bit like realizing that no matter which route you choose, you're likely to hit traffic at some point.
So even though each decision felt important in the moment, our brains might have figured out that it wasn't worth stressing over any single choice.
Right. Like, hey, it all kind of evens out in the end.
Yeah.
Exactly. If the potential gains and losses felt too similar, our brains might have decided to conserve energy and not bother with a full-blown memory-based analysis for each decision.
That's interesting. So even though we as participants might have felt like we were making these high-stakes choices, our brains were like, not really worth breaking a sweat over this one.
It's possible, and that highlights just how complex the relationship is between our subjective experience, our behavior, and what we can actually measure in the brain. Sometimes our brains are making incredibly nuanced calculations that we're not even consciously aware of.
It makes you wonder how often our brains are operating on autopilot like that, making what seem like conscious decisions, but really they've already crunched the numbers behind the scenes.
Right. And this study also reminds us that context is key. Our brains don't just blindly apply the same decision-making strategies in every situation. They're constantly adapting and adjusting based on the perceived risks, rewards, and even just our own past experiences in similar situations.
It's like our brains are always trying to find the most efficient path, both literally and metaphorically. Speaking of which, I have to say this deep dive has given me a whole new appreciation for how my own brain tackles decisions, big or small.
Me too. And it makes you think. Are you a target common or target specific thinker? Next time you're faced with a choice, try paying attention to what's informing your decision. Are you someone who likes to consider all their past experiences, or are you more likely to zero in on what seems most relevant in the moment?
It's like a fun little brain game we can all play.
There you go.
I'm definitely going to be analyzing all my decisions from now on.
Well, thanks for joining us for this incredible deep dive into the world of brains, mazes, and memory-powered decision-making.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time.